Hey, look at that.
Oh, calling Chris Anderson a very well-dressed Chris
Thank you.
Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London calling a very dapper Rick Beyer in Chicago. It looks like you're in Chicago.
I am in Chicago. We're back home. This is the 1 week, and then you'll be on the road again. And then after that, the whole thing goes history happy hour, constantly moving and
Yeah.
traveling. Um, but welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris and I do travel the globe frequently, but we still manage to be here on Sundays, whether you like it or not, to have a cocktail and talk about history. And today we're going to be talking about Nazis again, as we, this case, Nazi billionaires, as we have so many times in the. How many shows have we done, Chris?
100, I think.
100.
100, believe it or
This is
not.
our 100th episode.
Didn't you say that this was only something we were going to do for a couple weeks?
I, just hearing the words 100th episode come out of my mouth, it's a little bit like, wow. I mean, there's shows that were TV shows that people loved that didn't get to 100 episodes.
Oh.
But we've
then there's
surpassed,
us.
we've gotten,
Yes.
and there's us, which is different
There's
in
us.
so many ways from that. But Chris, I thought since it's our 100th episode, well, first of all, we did dress for the occasion,
I know.
and you're doing the Empire proud there, and tell me about that wonderful sweater you're wearing.
My Mr. Rogers sweater was knit by my lovely wife, and I thought I'd wear it here on the 100th episode.
Check
to
that
thank her.
out.
I know.
Check that out. That's Anna has made Chris a 100th anniversary, a 100th episode sweater.
Sweater.
I wanted to know if it has a
It's
little.
the last
crest
one
on
I'm
it.
going to get.
I wanted to know if it has a little crest on it underneath, but
No.
possibly not. But Chris, I thought we should do a toast. I
should.
have some champagne right here, as I think you may as
do.
well.
Yeah.
So what on our 100th show? What should we toast?
We should toast our viewers,
Our loyal viewers, yes,
our Patreon subscribers particularly,
yes.
to make it all possible. Our guests for coming on the show and giving
One
us
of
something
whom is
to talk about.
patiently standing by
I know.
right now, wondering why he doesn't have a glass of champagne. But he's
And you, Rick. I
and
toast
you, Chris. It's great. It's fun. Here you go. Cheers.
Cheers.
And we hope everybody else is toasting with us. And when we play the open, when I made this open, 82 episodes ago or whenever it was, I didn't realize when I put that champagne
See?
cork in there that it was going to be something that would
Prophetic.
come in prophetic to the 100th episode. But Chris, I think we've made
Okay.
people wait long enough. It's time
I
to
think
get
so.
started. Give us the cue.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and Chris, what is on tap today?
Well, it's a fascinating new book by David De Jong, who is a journalist who has covered European banking and finance from Amsterdam and New York. Has written for Bloomberg. His writing has appeared in lots of journals you may have heard of, such as the Wall Street Journal, Dutch Financial Daily, Bloomberg, Business Week, and he's hopefully, once all of this book stuff is done, going to be moving back to Tel Aviv, where he's going to continue to write. But he's done a new book called Nazi Billionaires, which is, as the cover says, the dark history of Germany's wealthiest dynasties, which is getting quite a bit of coverage. So, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen, and congratulations. Here's
Wow.
to you.
Look at that.
Here's to you
Cheers.
about 100 episodes. That's quite
Yes.
It's a milestone for
It
sure.
is a milestone. Absolutely.
It is
Should be
a
celebrated. Milestones should always be celebrated.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So, but you're a lot more interesting than our 100th anniversary. So we want to dive right into the book here. And I wrote this down because I wanted to read something that was in a New York Times essay which you had just written, which kind of leads into the discussion. And in this essay, you say that remembrance culture has been a central component of German society. In cafes from Berlin to Frankfurt and from Hamburg to Munich, there are daily conversations about collective guilt and atonement. These are reflective, nuanced, and above all aware. Yet this movement towards facing the past is somehow bypassing many of Germany's most revered tycoons and their dark histories. So could you tell us which tycoons you're talking about, and what do we need to be more aware of?
So my book focuses on five families and their patriarchs. So it is Gunther Quant and his sons Herbert and Harold. The children of Herbert today control BMW, are the majority or the controlling shareholders of BMW. There is Friedrich Flick, very notorious, probably Germany's most notorious industrialist of the 20th century, who was convicted at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and war crimes. He controlled one of the largest privately held steel, coal, and weapons conglomerates during the Third Reich. And when he was released, when the Americans commuted his sentence for on good behavior, and when he was released within a decade, he was the controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz. So that's the second patriarch and dynasty. And then thirdly, there's the von Fink family, which is the financiers family, which co-founded Allianz and Munich Re, the global insurers, and they also co-founded a private bank called Merck Fink. Fourthly, there's the Porsche Pierre family, whose patriarchs Ferdinand Porsche famously designed the Volkswagen, and convinced Hitler to put it into production. His son-in-law Anton Pierre, who he co-founded the Porsche design firm with, and who he led very brutally the Volkswagen factory complex with, and their son Ferry Porsche, who designed, Ferdinand Porsche's son Ferry, who designed the first Porsche sports car after the war. And then fifthly, there's the Oetker conglomerate, mostly known in Europe for their baking goods products, but they own also a chain of luxury hotels like the Lanesborough, very famously in London, or Le Bristol in Paris, and the one Een Rock in Cap d'Antibes. And their patriarch Rudolf August Oetker joined the Waffen-SS voluntarily, grew up in a very ideological Nazi household, and then built up his family company, Dr. Oetker, into one of Germany's largest conglomerates post-war. So those are the five.
So you, in your book, you take a deep dive into the financial history of these families and their very close ties with the Nazis, or in some cases, they are really Nazis themselves. So I'm guessing that writing this book was not sort of a pleasant lark for you. It's some pretty dark stuff that you had to spend years on. So why did you undertake this investigation? How did you get started?
I mean, I got started on it when I was reporting for Bloomberg News from New York, actually, on the topic. I joined a team which investigated billion-dollar fortunes and privately held companies, privately owned companies by families. So, of course, Bloomberg's strength is covering listed, stock exchange listed companies, and this was a team that also really looked into family owned non-stock exchange listed companies, a hidden wealth, and as I said, billion-dollar fortunes controlled by families. I was actually hired as one of the one of the reporters covering North America, so covering the Coke Industries and the Koch brothers, the Waltons and Walmart, real estate fortunes. But I was soon asked, because I'm a native Dutchman, to add the German-speaking countries to my beat. And what I quickly found there were, these massive family-controlled fortunes and companies today, and particularly with BMW and Porsche, where they are pretending to have reckoned with their family history, or pretending to be, to have come clean about it, while in fact they're leaving it out, and they're kind of whitewashing it through these global foundation in the names of their exalted patriarchs or founders or saviors, celebrating their business successes, but leaving out their war crimes they committed, or their Nazi affiliations that they had. And the book in the end is a argument in favor of historical transparency. If you want to conduct global philanthropy in the names of these men, and one wants to learn something from history, don't only show and celebrate their business successes, but also be transparent about the dark side of these men.
So one of the things that really struck me reading the book is how, I don't know if colorless is the right word for some of these guys, but they're pretty banal people.
Yeah.
Could you just, I mean, not to give too much away, but just take one of the founders of one of these companies and as an example, say, where does he come from? How does he get where he's going?
Yeah, sure. Let me take the main, as I view as the main character, which is Gunther Quant, who was the patriarch of the Quant dynasty, today Germany's wealthiest business dynasty, whose heirs, two of their heirs, control BMW today. He grew up in a textile manufacturing family outside of Berlin, in rural Germany, and he managed to get control. He had larger ambitions for himself. And after World War I, he moved to Berlin and quickly ended up profiting from the hyperinflation that befell the Weimar Republic, as Germany was called at the time, or known informally. The hyperinflation that befell the Weimar Republic after World War I, buckling under the stringent reparations that were imposed on Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. Hyperinflation, caused people, wiped out basically all the wealth for the middle class, for the Germany's middle class. But speculators were able to profit greatly from it. So did another main character in my book, Friedrich Flick. But Gunther Quant managed to parlay part of his wealth into getting control over a battery factory in Berlin, or a battery company that was based in Berlin. It was a global company called AFA, and a weapons manufacturer called DWM, and that laid kind of the groundwork for the Quant business empire. Now, not only did he do that, he was a widower. His wife died in the Spanish flu, his first wife, Antonia. And on a train trip from Berlin, on a business trip from Berlin to central Germany, he meets a 17-year-old girl, or teenage girl, his name is Magda Friedlander, who he marries. He's 37 at the time, who he quickly asks for her hand and marries, and they have one son, Harold. But in the late 20s, their marriage dissolves. I mean, they're a complete mismatch from the start, basically. She's interested in money and power. He's interested in, having a wife, basically. And yeah,
check.
Exactly, check. I'm a rich industrialist. I need a wife. And they divorce, and she remarries to a man named Joseph Goebbels, who is then who when they meet is the district chief for the Nazi party, for the burgeoning Nazi party in Berlin, and the campaign manager and the propaganda manager or leader for the Nazi party. And they become, obviously Magda and Joseph Goebbels become the most notorious couple, arguably. Even, I would say on par with Hitler and Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. So there's a lot, this all happens prior to 1933. So,
but there's you write about this. There's this amazing interplay between Joseph Goebbels, his wife Magda, Gunther Quant, and kind of an argument after the war, right? Because Quant essentially he's involved in a lot of things that are pretty atrocious things, but after the war he's like, I was forced to do this. I was forced to be in, was he in Himmler's circle of friends?
No, he was not.
Oh, but he was a supporter, and
I mean, he profited on every. He benefited on every level from the Nazi regime's rearmament policies, from their mass use of forced enslaved labor, from the expropriation of Jewish-owned companies and companies that happened to lie in Nazi-occupied territories. I mean, he was one of the Gunther Quant became one of the largest industrialists of the Third Reich.
So, David, one of the questions I have, and I know it's like one of these unanswerables questions about the Third Reich, is what did these industrialists see in Hitler? You know, when they get involved fairly early. He's at that point sort of a non-entity, and I mean, you even have Quant saying, "I can't say that Hitler made a significant or meaningless, sympathetic or repulsive impression on me. He struck me as perfectly average."
Yeah,
so where do they say, okay, but he's our guy?
Well, they say it at the point. I mean, they found Germany's big business found Hitler to be, when he first started his rise in the mid 1920s until, I would say, September 1930, when the Nazi Party had their first electoral success. For the first 5-6 years, they found Germany's businessmen found, or big business found, the Nazi Party to be, boorish, garish, outlandish characters from the impoverished hinterlands, from the provincial parts of Germany, and they didn't want anything to do with it. This was not an establishment party. It was only after October 1929, with the start of the Great Depression, the implosion of the New York Stock Exchange, or at least Black Monday, and mass unemployment hitting Germany extremely hard. In the wake of the Nazi Party's first electoral success in September 1930, a campaign led by Joseph Goebbels, that is the point where Hitler starts reaching out to, I mean, mind you, Hitler also does not have any business connections.
Right,
I mean, there's two famous industrialists, Fritz Thyssen and Hermann Röchling, who are like his first industrialist supporters. But for 5-6 years, there is no support from business for Hitler. So it's only then, when Hitler starts asking his economic advisor to reach out to businessmen and financiers, and they have all these meetings at a hotel in Berlin near the Reich Chancery. And that is, and they're still quite skeptical, because Germany is so volatile politically and economically at this point, that they're like, okay, there's a new chancellor every year, or every 3 months, or every 6 months. So it's only when he seizes power on January 3rd of 1933, and in the weeks following that they are throwing. I mean, they don't even do it. I mean, most of these men were not Nazi support. Were not. Right. I mean, they signed up. They became members of the Nazi Party. Most of them, I write about. So, they were in fact members of the Nazi Party. Were most of these men ideologues? No, they were sheer opportunists.
It just strikes me, because I mean, this class of people tend to be certainly educated, certainly not foolish, and yet they just open their checkbooks and they say, "Yep, that's great." And I've often wondered why a few of them aren't saying, "No, wait a minute, maybe there's a different." I mean, within their goals, maybe there was a different alternative. But you talk about these meetings where they just whip out their checkbook and say, how much?
Yeah, I mean, they saw an opportunity also for what they perceived as to be a stable period for Germany, right? And of course, this being the Great Depression, and there's millions of people are unemployed. They see an opportunity, and with a rearmament that Hitler promises, they see an opportunity to benefit from, or to revive their companies as well. I mean, the German economy, the global economy, was in the pits, and they didn't, if they could profit from all its awful discriminatory legislation They wouldn't mind that, the goalpost was the goalposts of morality were moved further and further.
Yeah.
And with every play they went along.
Well, as the goalposts of morality were moved, they got involved, and you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about some of the things that these businessmen were involved with that go, kind of far beyond, doing business. We're just businessmen. We happen to be here in Nazi Germany, but they are involved in slave labor and other things. Talk a little bit about that and some of the, I would say, crimes isn't too strong a word that they were involved in.
Certainly, that is certainly not too strong a word. That's the right description of it. I mean, it starts innocuous with Germany's with the initiation of German rearmament under Hitler, secretly at first, because it goes against the Treaty of Versailles, under which Germany had to disarm completely. You have soon from 1934 onwards, you have billions of Reichsmark flowing into the coffers of German businesses to build up to going from the Nazi regime to the coffers of German companies to build up rearmament, to start mass producing arms and all sorts of weaponry. And then from 1935 onwards, with the implementation of the Nuremberg race laws, this other component comes in, which is the increasing disenfranchisement of Jewish citizens of Germany. Which starts with, the removal of citizenship for Jewish German citizens, but also deals with their de facto expropriation of their assets. So there's this term which I use a lot in the book called Aryanization, which is the removal of the Jewish element from an asset, right? Whether there was a Jewish-owned business or the Jewish element of ownership from an asset, whether there was a Jewish-owned business, land, houses, jewelry, art, anything of relative value. And I give many examples in the book of that very insidious, practice. Which started out, which had, of course, this being Germany, it had to have the veneer of a normal
legalization,
business.
Right?
Exactly.
The veneer, legal.
Technically legal. It starts out. I mean, even though most of the business, almost all of the business owners are, if not all, are forced to sell their assets far under the market value.
The Jewish business owners.
The Jewish business owners far under the market value of their assets. And later, it goes into outright a seizure and expropriation of their assets, which are then transferred into the hands of the men that I'm writing about.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I have always kind of mentally imagined this as something that the government is doing, but the government is setting up a sort of a structure and then saying to the businessmen, "Go, you do it," and the businessmen are going, "Okay," because because I can now own the company by buying my partner here out. For a quarter of the value or a tenth of the value, and you kind of have to take the deal because otherwise, and it happens in some cases, you don't take the deal and it ends up getting seized anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Or you receive nothing for it. So it's do if it's do or die, in a way.
And part of
literally,
part of these businesses that these families now still control are built on these businesses that were Aryanized, right? So,
Well, no. I mean, most of the assets were either. I mean, it depended, right? After the war, either if they were in Soviet occupied territories, they were expropriated by the Soviet Union, and then, of course, after the reunification for Germany, the rightful heirs tried to get the assets back
Okay.
in East Germany, or they were restituted, or they were, at least the heirs tried to get restitution for the companies or the shares or the buildings that were stolen from them, or bought from them far under the actual market value of an asset. It is not the case that there are, or at least not the companies I'm writing about, where there is still kind of a basis of Aryanization of the companies they control today.
Okay.
But on the other hand, they certainly, these businesses, another thing that they're involved in extensively is the use of slave labor, forced labor, often people who are worked to death or killed in various other ways. And that is kind of the basis to some degree of the continued fortunes that they've created.
Well, in the sense that, of course, as German men get drafted and called up to the front, there's a huge labor shortage during World War II in Germany. So what happens is the largest coercive labor program that the world has ever seen is initiated by the Nazi regime. And millions of men, women, and children are rounded up in the streets of Europe, all over Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and are deported to German mines and factories where they are either forced to work for doing forced labor, which meant they were paid a pittance, or use a slave labor, which meant that they didn't receive anything for the work. So, in a sense, you're right with what you're saying, because there was a continuation of labor that kept these companies afloat during World War II, which else they would have had to shut down, and they had to suspend production. Because there was such a severe labor shortage. Of course, another aspect is, of course, concentration camp labor, is the SS maintaining concentration camps across Nazi-occupied territory and in Nazi Germany itself. And there were many collaborations between very well-known companies today and concentration camps where men and women were sent to work in Volkswagen factory, BMW, Daimler, Siemens, as slaves.
So, David,
under the most horrific circumstances.
Could you talk a bit about that? Because one of the things I know that has shocked me a bit, that I don't think people are really aware of, is that talk about how the industrialists are paying the SS for the labor.
Yeah.
So they have to be aware of what's going on, right? If they're
sure, of course. Yeah. No, absolutely. So there was a deal where they leased. I mean, it's as sick as you get it. I mean, they leased concentration camp inmates they paid 6 Reichsmark for unskilled labor to the SS, these companies that I'm writing about, and many others too, and 9 Reichsmark per day per captive for skilled labor to the SS. I mean, it's
So, did you? Reading the book, it's sort of, as always, it seems to me, reading books about Nazi Germany, it's this descent into hell that, everybody sort of starts off thinking it's politics as usual or business as usual, or we can control Hitler, or we can work with this guy. And then eventually you go down to the, seventh circle or whatever of hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you run across anything where any one of these people, even in private, said, wait a minute, we're helping make this happen, and we're helping him, do this by all the stuff we're doing, and we're very complicit. This is really not something we should be involved in. Any qualms from anybody?
No. There was zero, no reflection whatsoever. In the 4 years I spent doing this research from Germany, and the decade I've spent reporting on this topic, I have not come across any of that, or at least not from the families that were involved in the book that I was writing about in the book.
So,
there's one incident where actually, where one character in the book was a Nazi, I was a totally convinced Nazi, even to the detriment of his business, which is the Rudolf August Oetker's stepfather, Richard Kaselowski, where his stepson, Rudolf August Oetker, is going to acquire a house from a Jewish man, and who had to flee, who was a tobacco executive in Hamburg, who fled to Germany, sorry, to Australia, and his house is for sale, and his stepfather warns him, if this is 1937, 1938, tears stick to this house. His Nazi stepfather. I mean, I that stuck with me because that is, of course, a very
poetic,
it was very out of character remark for any of the characters that I read. But
Given, I want to get into the post-war stuff
sure.
in a minute, but just all the stuff leading up to the war. These guys building their empire, rise of the Nazis, World War II. Was there anything that really kind of struck you or surprised you, or that you didn't expect to find, or were you kind of, did you have an idea of what you were going to find before you got there, or?
I think I hoped for, maybe naively, that there was exactly the kind of reflection that you pointed out. I think I was struck by that the callousness was so much worse than I expected it to be. Yeah.
So you get the war. The war comes to an end,
Mm-hmm.
and many of the folks that you profiled are in fact arrested or detained often by the Americans for their complicity with the Nazis. But as you write, most of them managed to evade any really serious punishment or financial penalty. It's not too long before it's business as usual again. The dynasties flourish. So what happened?
Well, what happens is that the Cold War starts, and Nazi Germany is quickly forgotten, and its perpetrators, and the big enemy becomes the Soviet Union, and of course, West Germany being the still is, well, Germany now, a reunified Germany still is today, but West Germany is Europe's largest and most strongest economy. And the U.S. wants a viable partner as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, encroaching Soviet Union, and policy changes quickly accelerate from 1947 onwards, which sees most of the handover of suspected Nazi perpetrators and sympathizers to the Germans themselves. And a very flawed legal process is initiated called denazification, a word we all hear a lot these days because it's what Putin uses as a justification of what he's doing in Ukraine, which is beyond obscene and perverse and horrific, because you talk about denazification about a country with a Jewish president. I mean, it's just, again, beyond. And this process of denazification sees, with the exception of Friedrich Flick in my book, all the main characters in my book get off scot-free, or with a fine at best.
Can I do a follow-up, Chris?
Absolutely.
You introduce a word, a concept I had never heard before. I was quite fascinated by, and I might say it wrong, but a Perselschein.
Yeah, Perselschein.
Explain what that is and why it becomes a factor, and something these families are desperate for, and maybe are sort of in some ways buying to kind of buy their way out of this.
Yeah, in the concept of Perselschein, so a Perselschein is a parcel ticket. So Persel is a laundry. It's literally it's a very famous laundry detergent, actually produced by in part produced by Unilever, but also in part produced by by Henkel, which is controlled by the Henkel family, one of Germany's also most famous industrialist families, and a Perselschein, a Persel ticket, is a ticket to be washed clean, or a tongue-in-cheek expression deeply cynical expression, to be washed clean of Nazi sympathies and any affiliation with Nazi crimes. In these denazification processes, of course, there were millions. They had to denazify millions of Germans, right? So for the common German who was suspected of these things, one Perselschein was often, which meant a statement attesting to somebody's, apolitical, anti-Nazi stance, affiliation with the resistance, or reformed, some kind of, he's now a reformed man or woman, was enough to get the label denazified or entlastet, which means exonerated in German. There were 5 categories in where one could be put in, where one could be ruled in under a denazification panel or trial or process. It depended also on the occupation zone. Of course, for the men I'm writing about, they needed much more than one Perselschein. These were, Germany's most powerful and most notorious industrialists and financiers. So whose denazification trials were much more high profile, and the charges against them much more serious. So they, end up collecting 30, 40 to, hundreds of Perselscheins, of Persel tickets, to attest to their, supposed anti-Nazi, apolitical, even victimhood under the Nazi regime. And the most powerful of Perselscheins were, of course, those provided by men and women who were either from a Jewish background or with a Jewish connection. So, and they were called, cynically called alibi Jews. After everything that, these people tend to, these people were still very powerful after the war. They may have been detained. Most of their assets part of their assets may have been expropriated in the Soviet occupied territories, and the Americans or the Allies were investigating them. But these men and their connections and their names and their companies still held a lot of sway, even under American occupation, and they had to consider every move that they were making. But there were still a lot of people who either, and even those from Jewish descent or with Jewish connections, or who had survived or had fled to the U.S. Some of them that they had even helped prior to the war, or helped fleeing, that were willing, for those reasons or for other reasons, to provide a statement attesting to these things, or attesting how they helped them, without going into because of course many of the men and women who provided these statements, of course, also were not aware what these men had actually done during the war, or the companies that they had acquired from Jews. This was all very hush-hush. It wasn't as if these were open secrets, because they were not, for the most part, ideologues.
So you say in the book, and this is kind of a continuation of what we've been talking about here, it says, but as was typical of the Allied authorities, the tycoons' brutal labor practices weren't even a point of interest for the French government.
Yeah.
Now, at the end of the war, the newsreels of the concentration camps are everywhere. They march German civilians past camps. The Allies,
sure.
Everybody knows about this. How is that so quick? The crime that enormous so quickly overlooked?
I think the relation between big business and concentration camps was not that was not that known publicly. I think in the grand scheme of things, in the chaos that was post-war Germany, post-war Europe, the kind of institutionalized collaboration between German business and the Nazi regime was not really a topic of discussion. The focus was very much on the political and the military leadership. Of course, under Nuremberg, you have the industrialist trials, which sees Friedrich Flick and his associates get indicted and convicted, Alfred Krupp and his associates get indicted and convicted, and the entire board from IG Farben, the world's largest chemical and pharmaceuticals company, gets indicted and convicted. So there are these trials, but there's such a discrepancy between what ends up to a larger audience. A lot of this information, and I think many people must have thought too that these were just an exceptions. I don't think it was not kind of ingrained. It never became ingrained until much later in global conscious or European or American conscious that how deep the ties were between, or at least when it came to forced and slave labor, how deep the ties were between the Nazi regime and German business. I mean, that came only in the 70s, 80s, 90s, many decades after the fact. Yeah. And to get back to your question, the Allies are not, the whole concept of forced and slave labor also in the Nuremberg trials, in the industrialist Nuremberg trials, sure, but like in the main Nuremberg trial, of course, also the Holocaust, these were not massive. They were very rarely referenced in the trials. It was not the institutionalized relation of that was not. Yeah, it was not so much reference. And there was just not a big interest on the Allied governments to focus on forced and slave labor in their own trials and prosecuting these men and women, or for prosecuting these men. It's bizarre, but it was the case. They glossed over it. They didn't also want to deal with the victimhood to an extent. It was not something that became a point, of course, at that point in time, right? Of course, later, from the 1960s and 1970s, with the rise of Holocaust awareness, and of course after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the plight of forced slave laborers becomes much more prominent in Europe and in the United States.
Your anger pulsates through this book, and it's not, just to be very clear, it's not a diatribe. It's an investigation, and you're a journalist, but your anger is there. At least what I see is your anger, your wrath about what you feel these families got away with. And I wonder, kind of, in this whole scope of investigation, what kind of made you the angriest, or most made you shake your head?
Wow, so many times. I mean, there were so many things where it's very hard to choose one, because the reason why I started writing the book was because I was just struck by the fact that, by the blatant whitewashing that is happening today in the name of, Ferry Porsche or Herbert Quant, where you have these mass global foundations, doing good things. Let's not make any mistake about that. But in the name of men who committed war crimes, who voluntarily applied to the SS, and that history, by some of the most powerful companies or most well-known companies, and most powerful families in the world, is completely left out. And I think that is the reason that gave me the reason to write this book. And to at least, at the very bare minimum, argue for historical transparency on the part of these companies like BMW and Porsche, because particularly the BMW Herbert Quant Foundation, which has this motto, "Inspire responsible leadership," on the basis of Herbert Quant saving BMW from bankruptcy in 1959, but leaving out the fact that he planned, built, and dismantled a sub-concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, had the responsibility over battery factories in Berlin with thousands of forced and slave laborers, including 500 female slave laborers from concentration camps. The fact that he acquired battery companies in France who were seized from Jews, that he used on his private estate, prisoners of war and forced labor. You inspire responsible leadership by being again, at the very least, at the bare minimum, being transparent about history. And if that's not what you want to do, then you should not name your foundation after Herbert Quant. If you're not willing to own up to it, because then it becomes just it becomes obscene and a whitewash at that.
So, and David, your book focuses on these families that are kind of coalesce around the automobile industry, and that's interesting in its own right. But do you think if you dug into other aspects of big German corporations, it would be the same story, or is there something particular about these automotive conglomerates and the people that ran them, or is this kind of a guilt that's not really looked at?
No. I mean, it's omnipresent. I mean, I chose these 5 families. Part of them have their ties to the car industry, to the automotive industry, but I picked these families because they're still relevant in global business today, right? The Krups and the Thysens, for example, are not, and these are today they're Germany's and Europe's leading business families, to an extent also global, and that's why I picked these 5. It wasn't with a car angle in mind. I mean, it happened that the Quants, of course, the car industry is the backbone of the German economy, so it's no surprise that the Quant family came, perhaps to an extent, it's no surprise that part of the Quants came to control BMW after the war. They owned different businesses during the Third Reich. That the Porsche PX, of course, who started with the Porsche car design firm, and who helped design the Volkswagen, still control the Volkswagen Group today, and that the Flicks also after the war came to control Daimler-Benz, which they no longer do today. But of course, this being such a major aspect of of the German economy and of the European economy, it's no surprise that the concentration is very heavily in the car industry. But if I would look into other industries, which I also do in the book, it would be a similar story.
You actually write in the last or second to the last chapter about another family, the Ryman family, and with perhaps even, and we don't have to go into details, we'll leave it for people to discover, but perhaps even closer ties and fiercer ideology connections to the Nazis. And they control brands, ranging from or are involved with brands ranging from Peet's Coffee, a personal favorite of mine, to Keebler cookies. How should we as consumers? I mean, how do you think that? I mean, what should we be asking or demanding, or is this really just on the families themselves to do what's right? But what involvement what reaction should we have as consumers?
I mean, I use the Ryman as a kind of a positive counterexample where they were confronted with their bizarre Nazi history of their patriarchs, both very committed Nazis, even set in the municipality, donors to the SS, and their mother, who turned out to be of Jewish descent, and their grandfather was murdered in the Holocaust. So they have this bizarre story, very tragic story of being both a descendant from a perpetrator and a victim. But I give them because they established this foundation, the Alfred Landecker Foundation, named after their grandfather was murdered in the Holocaust. And they're both transparent about, but also still being transparent about their grandfather and their father, who were major Nazis, or convicted Nazis, or convinced ideological Nazis, even though their business was comparatively small, in relation to the other families I'm writing about. I mean, now the Rymans are one of Germany's wealthiest families, but back then they were not. That only came in the post-war era. I think consumers should always make up their minds for themselves. But I think as consumers, the bare minimum what we can expect is, if you are going to name corporate headquarters, if you're going to name products, if you're going to name media prizes, if you're going to name, global foundations in the name of Nazi perpetrators or Nazi sympathizers or both, at the very minimum, you should expect them to be transparent about that history. I mean, that's literally the bare minimum the argument of the book puts forward. And if they don't want to do that, they should not be named after these products. I think from a consumer perspective, should not be named, or these foundations or prizes or corporate headquarters should not be named after these men if they don't want to do that. I mean, that's the bare minimum I think that consumers should expect.
So what are the other things that I'm curious to get your thoughts on? I was struck, I touched on this at the beginning of our conversation, where we talked about how Germany is well known for its efforts to remember what had happened, and
sure,
there's a remembrance culture.
Absolutely.
But you also say that this is kind of the secret that everybody in Germany knows and nobody talks about.
Yeah. So, it's not even a secret,
So what does this say about Germans remembering the war and all of that? Is it genuine? Is it?
I think it's very genuine. Okay, I think it's very genuine. I think it's like what we see in many other countries, including the United States or the United Kingdom or my native Netherlands, is that, the wealthiest and most powerful often do not want to play by the rules of the rest of society, or at least in terms of morality and historical transparency. I mean, it's a global problem, right? I mean, you see this in this particular instance in Germany, although Germany has many other societal problems related and unrelated to its dark history. But you see it, unfortunately, you see it everywhere. I think Germany has done an incredibly good job at reckoning with its history, reckoning with its Nazi history. But I also feel that to an extent, and I said this earlier to you guys, there's also this sense of, a media story breaks, these families in response, a media story about a business family or company breaks, about a patriarch or their company's, brutal Third Reich history and their activities during that. They commission a study in academic German to a prominent academic. The study comes out, and then nothing changes. They don't, the findings of the study, and in a sense, it's also, these stories are contained to Germany, because I also feel that these companies and these families lean on this notion of collective guilt in Germany, where it's like, yeah, but we were all involved, right? So what's new here, really? And if you want to look it up, you can look it up in this 1,200-page book written in dense academic German. But then that always also goes, for me at least, the question is, who then exactly is this reckoning with, right? Because you're not reaching the majority of surviving victims of these families or their companies, who were, of course, for the most part, not German. And you're also not, having a true reckoning if you're not transparent about it afterwards, if you then go on pretending like nothing happened.
On the last page of your book, you write, the reigning generation of heirs still has the chance to alter course before passing their empires along, to commit fully to historical transparency and moral responsibility, and to strive unconditionally to repay to society the enormous debt to society that their fathers incurred. After all this work, how likely do you think that is to happen?
I'm an optimist, so I'm going to say likely. I think, the men and women, the current generation of heirs, they're ranging from their 40s to their 50s, 60s, 70s. I have good hope that regardless of my book, that they are going to come to a change and going to do the right thing, which, again, at the very least, is showing in a transparent and global way the war crimes that they're that their patriarchs or their fathers and grandfathers committed, alongside celebrating their business successes. So yeah, I'm going to say it's likely. I'm an optimist. I'm going to say this change is going to come. Many companies, I take Allianz as a prominent example, but it's no longer controlled by a family, is doing that. If you go to the Allianz website, they're incredibly detailed in English about how they robbed policyholders, how they ensured concentration camps, how they paid out policies or how they didn't pay out policies to people murdered in extermination camps. They're very transparent about that, and that's historical transparency that one should strive for, because that's how you learn from history. Again, I mean, I'm sound like a broken record here, but it is by showing the good and the bad,
Well, you're to be commended, David, for being able to have an optimistic feeling at the end of this process. I mean,
that's the biggest surprise for me coming out of this, but it's nice to hear. Yeah, David De Jong, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And David's book, of course, is Nazi Billionaires, The Dark History of Germany's Wealthiest Dynasties. In early May, you're doing a 2-week book tour in Germany, so I'll be interested to know how that... Not that it won't be well received, because I imagine it will be well received, but I'll just be interesting to hear kind of how that compares with how it's received in the U.S. and sort of what you learn or what kind of reactions you get as you're going along and doing that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, Rick and Chris. And again, congratulations on the 100th episode. It was an honor to be there in this milestone episode.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And
you'll be happy to know that folks are saying that they've already bought the book on Amazon. So
okay, so it's happening. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, David.
Chris, I do want to make a mention of all of our great supporters on Patreon, but specifically our top shelf patrons who are listed here. If your name's not on here, you can go to patreon.com/historyhappyhour to find out how to get your name on there. And of course, to all of our patrons, whether they're top shelf patrons or not, we do appreciate all you guys being here and helping support our efforts to put history out there. And Chris, next week we are going to talk about some more bad people.
More odious individuals, yes.
More odious individuals, but of a slightly, they're kind of Nazi related, but what's up with next week?
They're better dressed.
What's the story with next week here with the book, The Traitor King?
Yes, we're kind of going into some of the details of just how involved the Duke and Duchess of Windsor got in supporting the Nazis and right-wing fascist movements, and Andrew Lange has some pretty startling evidence that suggests that the once King of England was an out-and-out traitor to his country. So
it says as seen on TV, but I would say as will be seen on History Happy Hour.
There you go.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been great.
Safe.